The thing to just not stray away from here is that, I mean, we talk about story and we talk about, telling a compelling or a satisfying story. But at the end of the day, this is still a game. And in the process of playing a game, there's going to be random shenanigans that happen. And if we are not supposed to look at this. And let me be very clear: when you play D&D at your table, don't look at it like it's supposed to be a film. It's a game, and we can play it. We can think about this cooperative narrative structure, and also it's a game. And a lot can be gained from sort of relaxing on that and allowing ourselves to explore that together. Sometimes, like, one of my biggest things in the beginning of this whole endeavor was I would care too much about trying to make a cohesive story, and then that would actually rob us of our creative freedom to do that, because it was too structured, it was too tight. I was trying to make it too tight too quickly, when it needs time to flow and it needs time for the players to enact their own agency into the world. That's so important to remember. So when we're talking about all this stuff, when I'm coming at it from a finished film, it was an interesting observation, but I'm not saying it's a doctrine to follow.
Like Ian was talking about creating compelling stories, and suspension of disbelief is a very relevant practice when it comes to filmmaking. And like you said, Adam, this is a game, and a lot of players are coming to the game to interact with the game. Like, they're not there to tell a compelling story, right? In fact, they don't want a compelling story. Some of them just want to mess around, There's no, and the satisfaction comes from play, not from storytelling, So especially for younger players, like, you think of like teenagers when they first play D&D, a lot of times they're making joke characters like the blob named Bob and Zoblin the Goblin, like they don't want, like, they're there to avoid seriousness because they can find seriousness in other mediums, Now that doesn't mean eventually they'll mature, and I'm not saying it's more mature to like have compelling stories. It's just your tastes may change over time. Kind of like your taste in film might start with comedies, but then you end up liking dramas, and then you like having a blend, and then you end up like like some of the, like Quentin Tarantino trying to blend genres or something like that. My favorite, you were talking about like the nostalgic films that you're kind of going back to. I'm watching a lot of old anime. Like, I just finished up Trigun, which is a lot of times one of the magical things about that medium in particular is how willing they are to break convention just to see kind of what'll happen, and it's something that frankly used to irritate my dad. Like, I remember trying to describe to him something. He's like, it just doesn't make sense. And it's like, because he's thinking of it in terms of what are my expectations of what I already know, as opposed to what becomes possible when you have spaceships and jazz music and cowboys and robots and samurais and magic and when you take all these different flavors and you mix them together, you get a unique thing, So it's
which also, as a very quick aside, which is why I never quite agree with the people who got really up in arms about the Star Trek reboot, because that opening scene should have become a what becomes possible moment instead of a how dare you ruin my Star Trek, because they're not ruining your Star Trek. Your Star Trek still exists. It's still there. It's still medium. You can still go watch it. This is an opportunity to tell a different story. And what becomes possible if Vulcan is destroyed? What becomes possible if Kirk's father isn't with him when he's growing up? How does that change things? And what new interesting stories can we tell if those things in the timeline are changed? It doesn't have to be a static progression. We're not going to retread the same things.
Yeah, right before I hand it off to you, Ian, like, that was one thing with the Final Fantasy VII remake, is that there were a lot of story beats that were changed, and people were like, but now is it still Final Fantasy VII? And that is the exact thing. Whenever I go to see like a remake or a reboot, I'm looking to see what they changed, because why tell the story if it's literally the exact same thing with the exact same everything? what value does it bring? Why don't I just go play the old thing, you know?
Lion King, Disney.
Yeah, so it's that's to edit this out. That's a legal maneuver. They're trying to keep their properties from passing over copyright. So if they remake it, their copyright gets extended. So it's purely
money.
So my fiance is really into Marvel and a little bit of DC. And if there's anything that I've learned from living with her and listening to her talk about Marvel and DC, it's that a lot of the fans, a lot of the big fans for these universes are really less interested in the actual story that's being developed by these movies in the Avengers and stuff, and more of what the characters are going to do in the unique situations they're put in. So I think that kind of applies itself to D&D really well, because we're, as DMs, we like to create compelling stories. We may have an overarching arc and stuff, but really it's not about the arc, it's about what the characters are doing in that arc. And that's where, player agency comes in, creative freedom, and reactivity comes in for how these characters are going to, do stuff when they're presented with these scenarios. So, with the vampire spawn from Curse of Strahd, some people might be, sympathetic. Other people might be like, vampires are a curse upon this land and we must destroy everything. So I think that's really the big appeal with a lot of these, legacy movies like the Avengers and Iron Man and these guys, because you're rebooting how you're not only rebooting the story, but you're rebooting the characters and what situations they're going to be in by default. So I just thought that would be something to point out.
What's really happening here, we're when you think about the lineage of comic books and the dozens of various television series that started and ended with the various characters, every time you enact a new medium and a new, say, a cinematic universe, if you will, now, what we're really paying attention to, I completely agree with you, Ian, that like the stories of Thor, I don't really care about the plot of Thor and Thor: The Dark World, but I care about Thor, and I care about Loki, and I care about how those characters change and what the events of those films do to them. And then we see those changes throughout, like, the team up films. We see them in other films because of the continuity and the timeline of it all. So like post Ragnarok Thor is way different than Avengers Thor, and as he should be. He's gone through some things, and post Endgame Thor is going to be very different, of course. And that'd be really interesting to see how those characters change. Whereas like D&D, we're discovering that especially in different campaigns, but as we do more and more campaigns, it's and I think this was part of what kind of happened in Night Owls for season 3. We also we went from having a physical space and then we went digital, so we kind of changed the level of storytelling intimacy over the course of play, and it became less and less about, I'm going to bring this wacky character to the table and we're going to see how they play mechanically in this new challenge, and became, I'm going to bring back this character and see how they've changed in this new challenge. And this challenge changed them. I got so many more messages saying, oh yeah, seeing Eld die in front of me, that has changed this character fundamentally. They're going to act differently now. And it's that those individual events, now it becomes character driven. It's not, because Night Owls' whole format was that it was intended to be like a monster of the week with an overarching theme. That became less and less important, especially in that third season. It became so much more about, I'm bringing back this same character. Not every time we play I have a new character, because that's what it used to be. Or they'd shuffle like 3 different characters and see how that would go. It was, I bring back this character because they've changed the most. And these events have now altered their trajectory, and I want to see where this one sends them this time. And it's so much more character driven. It's because then the big grand plot isn't as important. It pales in comparison to the development of our characters. And that's maybe where we find the greatest value because each character is connected to a player. And those players now have agency inside this grand world, and they can choose how they're going to react to various events, big or small, in each instance.
Thank you so much for listening to some of our podcast highlights. This podcast is part of the Darkmoor Podcast Network. If you want to support the content creators, feel free to visit our Patreon. And please, game responsibly.